Hi everyone, it's Kathy. Thank you so much for joining me. Today I'll be creating this Slimline Easter card and I'll be using the Spring Bunny stamp set along with the coordinating dies. I'll also be using the ATC Slimline Windows die set. You get a whole bunch of dies in this particular die set, but for my card I'll be using the largest die and then one of the rectangles just to make three little windows. As I was thinking about how I was going to go about creating this card, I ran into a little problem where I wanted to use all of the images from the stamp set. And I was trying to figure out the easiest way to do that without it being too much on a card, which is why I decided to cut three windows using the Slimline ATC Windows die set, because I thought maybe if I could just break it down into three smaller scenes that I could get it to balance. And I think that that ended up working out quite well. For the coloring, and I'm not going to leave all of the coloring in because there was quite a bit of coloring, but I did want to share how I colored the bunny. I stamped all of my images using Copic friendly ink. And for the bunnies, I used a series of warm grays. And because the gray markers blend easily, I started out with my darkest, which was W4, and added that in areas where the shadows would be the darkest. I blended that out with W3, and then I finished up with W1. I really wanted to make sure that I left the top of the bunnies' heads and the top of their ears pretty light so that my shadows stayed darker. For the fur around their muzzles and their tummies, I used E41 and E40. And for the insides of their ears and their noses, I used two shades of pink markers. I'll be sure to list all of the Copic markers that I used in the description box below for you, as well as all of the other products that I had used. When it came time to think about coloring all of the other elements for the card, I wanted to make sure that it still had a cohesive look, even though I was trying to create three little scenes in each of the rectangles. So to keep that cohesiveness and, of course, avoid rainbow vomit, I was very careful about the colors that I chose to color in the elements. I colored the one egg with the purple and the teal. Now, to make it cohesive on the other side, since there was less teal than purple, for the second egg, I did that one in pink and teal to tie those two eggs in together, and then I used my white gel pen to add some details to those eggs. I should probably mention that before I actually started coloring these images, I did have somewhat of an idea of how each of my little scene was going to look in each of the separate rectangles. So with that being said, for these two images here, I wanted to bring in the teal a little bit more bold in my middle rectangle, so I decided to use the teal markers to color in the larger egg. And of course, for the daffodils, I brought in yellow markers, and I used the same yellow markers for the little bird in the other image. Now to bring the pink into my middle rectangle, I used the same pink markers that I did on the egg that the bunny is holding and colored in the flowers underneath the large teal egg and also the flowers that were underneath the little bird, so then I could pull the pink color all the way down into my bottom rectangle on my card. After I had all of my coloring done and ran those images through my die cut machine with the coordinating dies, I then cut three white rectangles using the Slimline ATC Windows die set. And I did just a tiny little bit of ink blending with some green ink at the bottom of the rectangles and then faded up so that it would be light. And I went about halfway up. I did that just so my images would have somewhat of a ground to them to make sure that my images didn't look like they were just floating. To stamp my sentiment and get it centered how I wanted it, I arranged the elements on the rectangle in my MISTI, and I just used the magnet to hold it in place, and then I stamped the words. And I did stamp the words Happy Easter separately to get the spacing in between the words just right. I wanted to add a little bit of texture to my background, so I decided to use the Scratchy Plaid background stamp. I die cut a piece of light blue cardstock using the largest die from the Slimline ATC Windows die set. Once I laid the cardstock on top of the inked stamp, I made a little mark at the bottom where the stamp ended, just so I would know where to line it up when I stamped the rest of my panel. The trick to this is you want to move your cardstock panel up to the top to finish off the stamping. So after I had stamped that background, I grabbed that rectangle from the Slimline ATC Windows die set, and I ran it through my die cut machine 3 times. Now the spacing isn't exact between the middle and the bottom rectangle, but I knew that once I got all of my little elements adhered to my card that it wasn't going to be very noticeable at all. So I adhered my die cut panel to the front of my card base, which started out at 8.5 by 7. I scored it at 3.5 inches on the 7-inch side, so my finished card is 8.5 by 3.5. I used liquid glue to adhere that panel to my card front, just to make sure that I had a little bit of wiggle room because it is the exact same size as my card base. Once I had my background piece adhered to my card base, I used liquid glue to inlay the rectangles that I had done the ink blending on. And from there, it was just a matter of adding all of my little elements, and I used liquid glue for all of them. And I worked on one rectangle at a time. So for the top rectangle, I had adhered my little bunny holding the 2 eggs. And off camera, I had stamped and colored and die cut a couple of the other images from the stamp set. So to complete the scene in my top rectangle, I adhered an egg, a couple of flowers, and then one of the little butterflies. The butterflies, I colored those yellow because in that top rectangle, I didn't have any yellow, and I wanted to bring some yellow up so that it would be cohesive with my center rectangle. For the center rectangle, I just needed to balance out the right side a little bit, so I added flowers and then I added 2 butterflies. Finally, for the bottom rectangle, I added the other bunny and the chick with the flowers, and then to fill in that space between the bottom rectangle and the second rectangle, I added 1 more butterfly. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, we'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.